48 Laws of Power, Chapter 31. Control the options. Get others to play with the cards you deal. The best deceptions are the ones that seem to give the other person a choice. Your victim feels they are in control, but actually, you're puppets. Give people options that come out in your favor, whichever one they choose. Force them to make choices between the lesser of the two evils, both of which serve your purpose. Put them on the horns of a dilemma. They are gored wherever they turn. From early in his reign, Ivan IV, later known as Ivan the Terrible, had to confront an unpleasant reality that the country desperately needed reform, but he lacked the power to push it through. The greatest limit to his authority came from the boyars, the Russian priestly class that dominated the country and terrorized the peasantry. In 1553, at the age of 23, Ivan fell ill, lying in bed, nearing death. He asked the boyars to swear allegiance to his son as the new Caesar. Some hesitated, some even refused. Then there Ivan saw had no power over the boyars. He recovered from his illness, but he never forgot the lesson. The boyars were out to destroy him. And indeed, in the years to come, many of the most powerful of them defeated to Russia's main enemies, Poland and Lithuania, where they plotted their return and the overthrow of the Caesar. Even one of Ivan's closest friends, Prince Andrew Kurbsky, suddenly turned against him, defeating the Lithuania in 1564 and becoming the strongest of Ivan's enemies. When Kurbsky began raising troops for an invasion, the royal dynasty suddenly seemed more precarious than ever, with emerging nobles fomenting invasion from the west, Tartars bearing down from the east, and boyars stirring up trouble within the country. Russia's vast size made it a nightmare to defend. In whatever direction Ivan struck, he would leave himself vulnerable on the other side. Only if he had absolute power could he deal with this many-headed hydra. And he had no such power. Ivan brooded until the morning of December 3rd, 1564, when the citizens of Moscow awoke to a strange sight. Hundreds of sleds filled with square before the Kremlin, loaded with Caesar's treasures and provisions for the entire court. They watched in disbelief as the Caesar and his court boarded the sleds and left town. Without explaining why, he established himself in a village south of Moscow. For an entire month, a kind of terror gripping the capital, for the Muscovites feared that Ivan had abandoned them to a bloodthirsty boyars. Shops closed up and riots mobs gathered daily. Finally, on July 3rd of 1565, a letter arrived from the Caesar explaining that he could no longer bear the boyars' betrayal and had decided to abdicate once and for all. Read aloud in public, the letter had a startling effect. Merchants and commoners blamed the boyars for Ivan's decision and took to the streets, terrifying the nobility with their fury. Soon as a group of delegates representing the church and the prince and the people made the journey to Ivan's village and begged the Caesar in the name of the Holy Land of Russia to return to the throne. Ivan listened, but would not change his mind. After days of hearing their pleas, however, he offered his subjects a choice. Either they grant him absolute power to govern as he please, with no interference from the boyars, or they find a new leader. Faced with a choice between a civil war and the acceptance of despotic power, almost every sector of Russian society opted for a strong Caesar, calling for Ivan's return to Moscow and the restoration of the law and order. In February, with much celebration, Ivan returned to Moscow. The Russian could no longer complain if he behaved dictatorially. They had given him this power themselves. Ivan the Terrible faced a terrible dilemma. To give in to the boyars would lead to certain destruction, but civil war would bring a different kind of ruin. Even if Ivan came out of such a war on top, the country would be devastated and its divisions would be stronger than ever. His weapon of choice in the past had been to make a bold, offensive move. Now, however, that kind of move would turn against him. The more boldly he confronted his enemies, the worse reactions he would spark. The main weakness of a show of force is that it stirs up resentment and eventually leads to a response that eats at your authority. Ivan, immensely creative in the use of power, saw clearly that only one path to the kind of victory he wanted was a false withdrawal. He would not force the country over to his position. He would give it options, either his abdication and certain anarchy or his accession to absolute power. To back up his move, he made it clear that he preferred to abdicate. Call my bluff, he said, and watch what happens. No one called his bluff, but withdrawing for just a month, he showed the country a glimpse of the nightmares that would follow his abdication. Tartars' invasion, civil wars, ruin, all of these did eventually come to pass after Ivan's death. In the infamous time of troubles, withdrawal and disappearance are classic ways of controlling the options. You give people a sense of how things will fall apart without you, and you offer them a choice. I stay away and you suffer the consequences, or I return under circumstances that I dictate. In this method of controlling people's options, they chose the option that gives you power because the alternative is just too unpleasant. You force their hand, but indirectly, they seem to have a choice. Whenever people feel they have a choice, they walk into a trap that much more easily. As a 17th century French conteur, Ninon de L'Enclos found that her life had certain pleasures. Her lovers came from royalty and aristocracy, and they paid her well, entertained her with the wit and intelligence, satisfied her rather than demanding sensual needs, and treated her almost as an equal. Such a life was infinitely preferable to marriage. In 1643, however, Nina's mother died suddenly, leaving her at the age of 23. Totally alone in the world, no family, no dowry, nothing to fall upon, a kind of panic overtook her, and she entered a convent, turning her back on her illustrious lovers. A year later, she left the convent and moved to Lyons. When she finally reappeared in Paris in 1648, lovers and suitors flocked to her door in greater numbers than ever before, for she was the wittiest and most spirited courtier of the time, and her presence had been greatly missed. Nyan's followers quickly discovered, however, that she had changed her old ways of doing things and had set up a new system of options. The dukes, the Sagners, the princesses who wanted to pay for her services could continue to do so, but they were no longer in control. She would sleep with them when she wanted, according with her whim. All their money bought them was a possibility. If it was her pleasure to sleep with them only once a month, so be it. Those who did not want to be with Nyan, called a Payuri, could join the large and growing group of men she called her martyrs, men who visited her apartment principally for her friendship, her bidding wit, her lute playing, and the company of the most vibrant minds of the period, including Molitary, La Rochefoucauld, or Saint Evremond. The martyrs, too, however, entered a possibility. She would regularly select from them a favorite, a man who would become her lover without having to pay, and to whom she would abandon herself completely for as long as she so desired, a week, a few months, rarely longer. A payer could not become a favor by martyr, but no guarantee of becoming one. Indeed, could remain disappointed for an entire lifetime. The poet Charleville, for example, never enjoyed Nyan's favors, but never stopped coming to visit. He did not want to do without her company. As word of this system reached polite French society, Nyan became the object of intense hostility. Her reversal of this position of the courtisan scandalized the queen mother and her court. Much to their honor, however, it did not discourage her male suitors. Indeed, it only increased their numbers and intensified their desire. It became an honor to be a payer, helping Nyan to maintain her lifestyle in her glittery saloon, accompanying her sometimes to the theater, and sleeping with her when she chose. Even more distinguished were the martyrs, enjoying her company without paying for it, and in maintaining the hope, however remote, of someday becoming her favorite. The possibility spurred on many a young noble men. As word spread that none among the courtiers could surpass Nyan in the art of love, and so the married and the single, the old and the young, entered her web and chose one of two options presented to them, both of which amply satisfied her. The life of the quarter entailed the possibility of a power that was denied a married woman, but it also had obvious perils. The man who paid for the quarter service, in essence, owned her, determining when he could possess her and when, later on, he would abandon her. As she grew older, her options narrowed, as fewer men chose her. To avoid a life of poverty, she had to amass her fortune while she was young. The quarter's legendary greed, then, reflected a practical necessity, yet also lessened her allure, since the illusion of being desired is important to men, who is often alienated if their partner is too interested in their money. As the quarter's aged, then she faced a most difficult fate. Nyan de L'Enclos had a horror of any kind of dependence. She early tasted a kind of equality with her lovers, and she would not settle into a system that left her such distasteful options. Strangely enough, the system she devised in its place seemed to satisfy her suitors as much as it did her. The payers may have had to pay, but the fact that Nina would only sleep with them when she wanted to gave them a thrill unavailable with every other quarter. She was yielding out of her own desire. Martyrs' avoidance of the taint of having to pay gave them a sense of superiority as members of Nina's fraternity of admirers. They also might someday experience the ultimate pleasure of being her favorite. Finally, Nina did not force her suitors into either category. They would choose which side they preferred, a freedom that left them a vestige of masculine pride. Such is the power of giving people a choice, or rather the illusion of one, for they are playing with the cards you have dealt them, where the alternatives set up by Ivan the Terrible involved a certain risk. One option would have led to his losing his power. Nina created a situation in which every option rebounded to her favor. From the payer, she received the money she needed to run her salon, and from the martyr, she gained the ultimate power. She could surround herself with a bevy of admirers and Harlem from which to choose her lovers. The system, though, depended on one critical factor, the possibility, however remote, that a martyr could become a favor. The illusion that riches, glories, or sensual satisfaction. The shrinking options. The late 19th century art dealer Ambrose Vollard perfected this technique. Customers would come to Vollard's shop to see some zines. He would show 3 paintings, neglect to mention a price, and pretend to doze off. The visitors would have to leave without deciding. They would usually come back the next day to see the paintings again, but this time, Vollard would pull out less interesting work, pretending he thought they were the same ones. The baffled customers would look at the new offering, leave to think them over, and return yet again. Once again, the same thing would happen. Vollard would show paintings of lesser quality still. Finally, the buyer would realize they better grab what he was showing them, because tomorrow they would have to settle for something worse, perhaps at even a higher price. A variation on this technique is to raise the price every time the buyer hesitates and another day goes by. This is an excellent negotiating ploy to use on the chronically indecisive, who will fall for the idea that they are getting a better deal today than if they wait till tomorrow. The weak man on precise. The weak are easier to maneuver by controlling their options. Cardinal de Retz, the great 17th century provocateur, served as an unofficial assistant to Duke of Orleans, who was notoriously indecisive. It was a constant struggle to convince the Duke to take action. He would hem and haw, weigh the options, and wait till the last moment, giving everyone around him an ulcer. But Retz discovered a way to handle him. He would describe all sorts of dangers, exaggerating them as much as possible, until the Duke saw a yawning abyss in every direction except one, the one Retz was pushing him to take. This tactic is similar to color of choices, but with the weak, you have to be more aggressive. Work on their emotions. Use fear, terror to propel them into action. Try reason, and they will always find a way to procrastinate. Brothers in crime. This is a classic con artist technique. You attract your victims to some criminal scheme, creating a bond of blood, and build blood and guilt between you. They participate in your deception. Hold on. Brothers in crime. This is a classic con artist technique. You attract your victims to some criminal scheme, creating a bond of blood and guilt between you. They participate in your deception, commit a crime, or think they do. See the story of Sam Jelsey in Law 3. And as easily manipulated, Serge Stavisky, the great French con artist of 1920, so entangled the government in his scams and swindled the state. Swindles that the state did not dare to prosecute him and chose to leave him alone. It is often wise to implicate in your deceptions the very person who can do you the most harm if you fail. Their involvement can be subtle. Even a hint of their involvement will narrow their options and buy their silence. The Horns of Dilemma. The idea was demonstrated by General William Sherman's infamous march through Georgia during the American Civil War. Although the Confederates knew what direction Sherman was heading, they never knew if he attacked from the left or the right, for he divided his army into two wings, and if the rebels retreated from one wing, they found themselves facing the other. This is a classical trial lawyer's technique. The lawyers lead the witness to decide between two possible explanations of an event, both of which poke a hole in their story. They have to answer the lawyer's question, but whatever they say, they hurt themselves. The key to this move is to strike quickly. Deny the victim the time to think of an escape. As they wiggle between the horns of dilemma, they dig their own grave. Understand, in your struggles with your rivals, it will often be necessary for you to hurt them. And if you are clearly the agent of their punishment, expect a counteract. Expect revenge. If, however, they seem to themselves to be the agent of their own misfortune, they will submit quietly. When Ivan left Moscow for his rural village, the citizens asking him to return agreed to his demand for absolute power. Over the years to come, they resented him less for their terror unleashed on the country because, after all, they had granted him power themselves. This is why it is always good to allow your victim their choice of poison and to cloak your involvement in providing it to them as far as possible. The horns of the bull backs you into corners with his horns, not a single horn which you might be able to escape, but a pair of horns that trap you within their hold. Run right or run left, either way, you move into their piercing ends and are gorged. Controlling the options has one main purpose: to disguise yourself as the agent of power and punishment. The tactic works best then for those whose power is fragile and who cannot operate too openly without incurring suspicion, resentment, and anger. Even as a general rule, however, it is rarely wise to be seen as exerting power directly or forcibly. No matter how secure or strong you are, it is usually more elegant and more effective to give people the illusion of choice. On the other hand, by limiting other people's options, you sometimes limit your own. There are situations in which it is to your advantage to allow your rivals a large degree of freedom. As with you watch them operate, you give yourself rich opportunities to spy, gather information, and plan your deceptions. The 19th century banker James Rothschild liked this method. He felt that if he tried to control his opponent's movements, he lost a chance to observe their strategy and plan a more effective course. The more freedom he allowed them in the short term, the more forcibly he could act against them in the long run.